As most of you know, the Prohibition era was filled with gangs, alcohol, and big changes among American society. Dictionary.com defines prohibition in two ways. The first, the action of forbidding something, especially by law, and the second is the prevention by the law of manufacture and sale of alcohol, especially in the U.S. between 1920 and 1933. During this time period, the people of the U.S. went through a time where alcohol was not an option for them, legally anyway. While this was true, there were several places who would sneak customers alcohol under the table. Alcohol that was served privately was usually hidden in coffee cups and known as speakeasies back in the day. Other than bars and stores sneaking alcohol to civilians, many Americans brought it on themselves to create their own concoction of drinks. This included the famous bathtub gin that ultimately, more often than not, would result in blindness or even brain damage. These small batches of homemade sources led to an increase of death rate over this time period. One of the biggest undercover sellers was the man himself, Mr. Al Capone. Al was known as Scarface because in the 7th grade he got into a fight that left him with a scarred left cheek. Eventually, the young man created a criminal empire smuggling alcohol mostly from Canada. This act of smuggling and importing was known as bootlegging. Bootlegging was a factor in the increase of organized crime and death rates throughout the U.S. With Al as their leader, he formed a syndicate, which is an organized crime that is operated like a business, complete with established territories and internal agreements. These syndicates were mostly used to smuggle smaller quantities with higher concentration of alcohol and hard liquor. On February 14, 1929, Al's men dressed as police officers and gunned down some of his competition inside a garage during one of their attempted deals. This was one of Al's specialties and then was named St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Police officers across the country were taken back by the fight against bootlegging alcohol. With all the new crime and commotion happening, they were left on their toes all day, every day. A new threat that the police force had to deal with were the uprising of gangsters and their gangs. Gangsters were organized crooks who worked hard to clean the streets of other criminals, but that didn't necessarily mean that they were clearing the streets of crime. Most gangsters were so loyal that they followed their friends to the grave. Then again, there were those who would stab their friends in the back just to save their own behind. The specialties of these semi-professionals were robbery, drug smuggling, car theft, gambling, murder, and more. After Al Capone made a name for himself, he racked up about $100 million from his operations. This was a red flag, especially to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI. All of Mr. Capone's violent crimes were pushed to the side and overlooked. In 1932, the U.S. Treasury Department busted Al for not paying his taxes on all of the money he had collected over the years. This put him in bars at the new maximum security prison on Alcatraz Island that was 1.5 miles away from the shores of San Francisco, California, which seems like a long swim if you ask me. After he was released in 1939, Al became very sick and later an invalid. In 1947, he got sick with pneumonia and died of a stroke. Although we focused a lot on Al Capone, who was top dog obviously, there were many other gangsters that made a name for themselves during this era. Bonnie and Clyde were known as the gangsters in love. This gangster couple skipped the dating life and went straight into killing, kidnapping, and robbery. These bored and poor folks met in Texas and had no jobs, and hey, honest work was clearly hard to find. Soon after they met, Clyde had to cut the honeymoon phase short by having a little bit of a prison sentence. Bonnie would visit him during visiting hours. There she met Frank Turner, Clyde's cellmate, and they divvied up a plan to bail Clyde out. This involved her smuggling a gun into the prison. But how could she say no? Her new lover was rotting alive in prison. While he was in there, Clyde was abused, and finally he asked another prisoner to chop off a couple of his toes so he could get out. The injury definitely sped things up a bit. Once they were reunited, the couple started in on their crime spree. They rounded up a gang and took off. They stole multiple cars, robbed a couple banks, and even kidnapped and murdered a few folks. Along with the gangsters of the U.S., women started to become more and more rebellious for their time. On page 43 of Flappers, A Guide to an American Subculture, Kelly Sagert states, during the 1920s, increasing numbers of young women began drinking alcoholic beverages. Prior to this era, proper women did not imbibe, and certainly not to the degree of some of the flappers. End quote. During the Prohibition, flappers were the rebels of the American woman. Flappers were originally brought about by the ideal of being a Gibson girl. A Gibson girl was created by the famous illustrator Charles Dana Gibson in some of his novels and stories. In addition to the gangsters, mobbers, and flappers of the U.S., many children were also rebelling and causing more ruckus than ever before. Hearing about the defiance and rebelling that was happening in the world caused them to realize they didn't necessarily have to listen to everything that Mommy and Daddy had to say. All in all, the crazy and dramatic time of the Prohibition era brought about many changes throughout the United States. From an increase in crime and death rates to women fighting back and doing what they want and not what they're told, America was flipped upside down before the Depression had even occurred.